But I want to just say that after being in practice for over 30 years, and that shows my own aging when you start, the numbers go up, I've noticed, themes emerge in your practice. And the prominent theme that I see in caregiving, and I know that our speakers will address this, is this tension between how do I care for someone I love and also take care of my life. And it takes on so many forms, but it's always there. And this question of what do I owe to my loved one? What do I want to give to my loved one? And am I entitled to, at the same time, feed myself? So those of you who work with caregivers are very familiar with them. The second theme that I have seen over and over is this, and actually I'm going to pose the question to you, which is how many of you have ever cared for a loved one? Raise your hand, please. Okay, wow. That's like everybody in this room. And how many of you anticipate perhaps caring for a loved one? And that's everybody in the room. And how many of you think of yourself as a caregiver? That's only a few of you. So here's the dilemma. How do we help those who are not themselves identifying as in need of help? And that's really what I think this talk is about. How do we support? How do we encourage? How do we help ourselves as we are caregivers and not necessarily thinking of ourselves that way? And how do we, in our practices as clinicians, do the work when it's not clear that someone's a caregiver? And those of you who are in clinical practice understand this because it can be sometimes weeks, months, maybe even years before it comes to light that someone actually is a caregiver. And yet, 1 out of every 4 people in this country are a caregiver, and everyone in this room has been a caregiver. So in the face of not being able to name it, and again, I would love to give a huge prize to anyone who comes up with a better term than caregiver, because nobody likes that word. So if anyone has ideas, I'd love to hear it. But let us know about that, because here's our struggle, here's our question today, and I'm really looking forward to our presenters in helping us understand that a little bit more fully. We also will have a panel of people who are on the ground at the front lines working with caregivers. So we'll take a break after our keynotes, and then we'll set up the panel, and you'll have an opportunity to hear from representatives who are doing the work locally. You also have in your bags an index card, and I'm hoping that as you listen to our keynote speakers and as you hear from the panelists, or hopefully before, you'll submit to us questions you may have anything having to do with caregiving, because we have really a richness of expertise here today that can help us in the conversation. So I hope you'll jot down your questions, and then we'll pose them to the experts. So that's the plan. And right now, I'd like to introduce our keynote speakers. So here we have flown in from the East Coast. First, I'll introduce Barry J. Jacobs, PsyD, who's a clinical psychologist, family therapist, and a principal for Health Management Associates, a national healthcare consulting firm. For 24 years, he was the director of behavioral sciences for the Crozer Keystone Family Medicine Residency Program in Springfield, Pennsylvania. He is the author of the Emotional Survival Guide for Caregivers, a columnist on family caregiving for AARP, and a national spokesperson on caregiving for the American Heart Association. Julia L. Mayer, PsyD, is a clinical psychologist and couples therapist with over 25 years of private practice and specializing in women's issues, including caregiving, because we know mostly our caregivers are women, and relationship concerns. Her practice is in Media, Pennsylvania. She's the author of a novel, A Fleeting State of Mind, and is the co-author with Barry of Art Meditations for Caregivers, Practical, Emotional, and Spiritual Support for You and Your Family. And they are the authors of books that they will talk about later on. You'll have an opportunity to think about purchasing. So without further ado, let me have us all welcome Barry Jacobs and Julia Mayer. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, the Santa Barbara Foundation, and Judy. It is really a pleasure for us to be here. I'm going to kind of step aside because otherwise the light is right in my eyes. And so where's Julie?
I'm here.
And what Elizabeth didn't say is that Julie and I have been married for 28 wonderful years. And so...
Thank you.
And so when our kids grew up and went off and lived their lives, we then started co-presenting a lot together, and it became a nice part of our marriage to write together and to present together. Just by way of doing a little housekeeping before we begin, so Julie and I went and kind of talked with some of you beforehand just to get a better feeling for who's here, and I did hear that pretty much everybody here has experience with caregiving. I just want to kind of ask in a little bit more detail, how many of you have in the past either are currently or have provided care for someone with dementia? Okay, and how about Parkinson's disease? Okay, cancer. All right, a lot of cancer. Oof. Heart disease. Okay, so we really have a range of diseases. I asked that question because a lot of the caregiving research is done on dementia caregiving, and so that's going to be reflected in what we have to say. But I'll make sure we talk about other diseases as well. And then I wanted to just get a better handle. How many of you are either social service or mental health professionals? Okay, you are in the right place. Okay, we're gonna talk together. This is going to be very interactive because the way we present is we're going to come down. And you're going to take the mic and you're going to talk, and so we'll have a conversation as much as possible. As a matter of fact, just for starters, we have our presentation, but I wanted to use this flip chart and just get down maybe a couple of ideas of things that you hope that we cover today, and we'll try our best to cover them. So are there any burning issues that people came here today saying, I want to hear about this? And don't be shy, please. Well, I'll give you one, just right off the bat.
There's a hand in the back.
Okay, good.
Yeah, shout it out.
How do you prevent caregiving burnout? That's a great question, and probably everything we're going to talk about today is going to be about that. But let me put burnout on there, and we'll have to define what burnout is. Okay, other questions, please. Finding a support group. Okay, I think our panel later will do a very good job in helping you find support groups. I can tell you what could be done nationally. There's a lot of support groups that are online, but for many people, they want to actually be in a room with other people, just like we have today. And so, support groups would be good.
There was another hand at the back. Did you have something? Okay.
Okay. So one of the things that I'm sorry. Please go ahead. Anger towards the person you're caring for, or anger from the care receiver toward the caregiver? I'm sorry?
Anger from me towards the person.
Caregiver anger.
Yes, which is very, very common. As a matter of fact, I will dare say that pretty much everybody in this room has experienced it. I write a monthly column on the AARP website, and I have a column that I wrote on this topic in the past about my losing it with my mother when I was caring for her. And so it's a very important topic. Please.
Anticipatory grief, especially when you're caring for your partner.
Sure.
Oh, that's a really good one.
Okay.
I just want to bring that one up.
All right, and I can actually spell anticipatory, so we're good. All right. All right. One I'm going to throw in here, because in the conversations, one second, Judy, the conversation I had with people, I heard this come up a number of times, and that is helping the person you care for actually receive care from you. This is often the case, whether it be a spouse or a parent, that you recognize that they need help. Professionals are expecting you to step up and help them, and the person doesn't want to receive help because they feel very diminished if they receive from you. So they fight you like the Dickens. So they take a hard situation and they make it harder because they want to preserve who they were, and then you become the enemy. Does that ring bells with anybody? So what we call that is receiving with grace. And I think in your packet there's an article with the title Receiving with Grace on this, but we'll try to also address it while we're here. All right, maybe one more topic, because right here.
Family dynamics.
Just a simple topic, right? We could just a few words, we can cover that. All right, sure. Family dynamics. And could you talk a little bit more about what about family dynamics?
How shall I say it, unexpected consequences of caring for someone whose other family members resent you for caring for that person when they won't step up to the plate.
So what we call is that you are showing them up, right? Because they in their perspective, from their perspective, you're showing them up. So that is a situation that we have heard many times. So I think this has nothing to do with anything we're presenting today, but this is a pretty good list. So we'll figure out how we're going to cover all these things, and we will. I promise you we'll cover all of them. So with that as introduction, let's get going. So we're going to, the first part of this we're going to do very quickly. We're going to just talk a little bit about what caregiving in America as a phenomenon looks like. And we're going to present a lot of what the research says about both the negative and positive effects of caregiving on caregivers. And I think many of us can attest to how hard this can be, what a toll it can take, the kind of burnout it might cause. But for many folks, there's a very sense of positive gratification that comes with this too. And so we'll talk about that. And then we'll move really into how do we help caregivers through counseling, therapy. What are interventions that seem to have some research support behind them? And then the main idea that we like to discuss is how do we find the positive rewards of caregiving? How do we find ways of finding the silver linings in this dark cloud? Because finding that silver lining will help sustain us as we go forward. So how does that sound? Good, okay. So just for starters, we're going to talk a little bit about our own family backgrounds, because we have doctorates, but I don't think you need a doctorate to be a caregiver here or to be a caregiver expert. You need to have some background in this. So this is a photograph from 1942. This is a picture of my father just after he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's at a dance with my grandmother. And if you can see my grandmother's face, she's glowing, because my father was her oldest child, the oldest male, and was her favorite by far. And she really doted on him throughout his life, and was very possessive of him. And so when my father graduated college and then went off to World War II, returned from World War II, he actually then came back and moved back into his parents' apartment in Queens, New York, where he stayed for another 10 years while my grandmother waited on him hand and foot. And my dad was a bit of a mama's boy. So my dad finally got out of the house in 1957. Here's a picture of my parents' wedding, and there's my mom in the lovely white taffeta dress on the right, and my dad in the kind of snazzy white tuxedo on the left, and there's my grandmother in between them. And that's pretty much where she liked to be in their marriage. So my mother and grandmother both loved my dad very much. They competed for his love and his affection, his attention. And they got along, I would say, okay. But then when I was 14 and my dad was 51, my dad developed brain cancer. And what happened then is my mom and grandmother then proceeded to fight about everything that they could possibly fight about. So they fought about where my father was going to be treated and what treatments he was going to receive. And my grandmother read about an experimental treatment for brain cancer in California, and wanted my mother to sell our family home in New York and move the family cross country to give my father the best chance of surviving. And my mother, who like all of us had multiple family roles, she was a wife, but she was also a daughter to her own aging parents and a mother to 2 children. She said to my grandmother, "No, I'm not going to sell the family house." And pretty much from at that point forward, the communication between them completely broke down. So much so that when my father died about a year after he was first diagnosed with cancer, my grandmother and mother then did not speak again for 17 years until the day Julie and I were married. So I share this story with audiences like you because this is an example of how caregiving can actually weaken families. It can cause a schism which compounds the suffering. It was bad enough for me to have lost my dad at the age of 15, but then in many ways I lost my grandparents because I could go see my grandmother afterwards, but my grandmother would just proceed to badmouth my mother the entire time I was with her, and that really weakened my relationship with her. My hope, I grew up to be a psychologist and a psychologist that focuses on family caregivers, and I did it because of my own family background, but also with the sense of mission that I want to find ways of having these experiences in the lives of families bring family members closer together and not weaken the bonds among them. So that's one family story. But if you live long enough, you then have multiple family caregiving experiences. So my mom went on and she got remarried, and she had a very nice next marriage to a man with whom she was married for about 30 years. And the last 15 of which they lived in Florida in a gated golf community, and my stepfather played golf 3 times a week until he developed Alzheimer's disease. And then in 2010, Julie and I moved them up from South Florida to live near our home in Pennsylvania in an apartment. And at that point, after about a year living in the apartment, my stepfather went into a nursing home, and my mother was going to the nursing home 3-4 times a week, literally to spoon feed my stepfather his lunch. And if she could get all of that plate of food, which doesn't look very appetizing to me, but if she could get that into him, then that was her way of helping him, and her feeling like she accomplished something that day. And even though I thought this was a very dismal place where he was, my mother somehow found joy in this, and that was a real lesson to me, that sometimes just making even small differences can bring caregivers to give them a sense of gratification that they wouldn't otherwise have. And then unfortunately, after my stepfather died, my mother developed dementia, and she too went into a nursing home after having a series of hospitalizations for falls and broken bones in 2015. And then here I am. I'm now the primary caregiver, and I'm tending to her in the nursing home until her death of complications of vascular dementia in April 2017. So that's a little bit about my background.
Thank you. This is a picture of my parents and our daughter, who's now 25. 26. Can't believe it. I think she was maybe 4 or 5 in that picture. My parents were doing pretty well, but shortly after this, my dad started to develop vascular dementia. He had type 2 diabetes. He didn't care for it well. And he started to have TIAs, little strokes. And my mother became his caregiver. And she, in typical caregiver fashion, did not care for herself. And my siblings and I have 3 siblings, would try to get her to do some self-care, take herself to the doctor, etc. And she was pretty stubbornly resistant. Here's a picture of her and I in Atlantic City on a balcony of a hotel room. Every now and then, she would let my sister and I give her a weekend of respite, and my older brother would stay with my dad. But unfortunately, my mother's health started to deteriorate because for many caregivers, if they don't do any self-care, there's tremendous risk to their own health. So my mother needed bypass surgery and a heart valve replacement, which she got. But unfortunately, a few days after her surgery, she passed away due to a kind of rare complication called hemorrhagic pancreatitis. So all of a sudden, this is a picture from her funeral. My sister took it. That's my older brother, my younger brother. There's my dad and me. All of a sudden, we were shocked by grief because none of us expected her to die. And at the same time, we had a crisis to caregive for him because my dad was in New York. I lived in Pennsylvania. My younger brother lived in San Diego. My older brother lived in New York, but about 45 minutes from my dad, and my sister's in New Jersey. So we had to get together and figure out how to make this work. My older brother did the most caregiving. with my dad, and eventually we moved him closer to my older brother. But I would go back and forth for the year and a half that he lived after my mother passed away, a 3-hour drive each way every other weekend so that he could have a break. So it was, speaking of family dynamics, it was challenging because there were 4 of us trying to figure out how to do this, and we all had our own opinions, and we all know best, especially my brother in San Diego. He could call and tell us what to do. But he would also come in. But at the end of the day, we're fortunate because it brought us closer. We worked out our differences. We cooperated as much as we could, and we're closer for it. So we have a pretty good outcome of a horrible situation.
So we share these stories not because they're unusual, but because they're very common. So there are about over 40 million Americans who are caring for loved ones in the course of any year. Some of them are doing this very intensively. They're living with somebody who they're caring for, and they're doing hands-on care daily. Others are bringing a bag of groceries over once a week and mowing the lawn. So it really ranges. But it's a number that's growing, and the number is growing because of 2 reasons. One is our population is aging, and we know as people get older, they have more health issues for which they need help. But it's also, the number is also growing because people are living longer with the kinds of diseases that would have killed them years ago. So they live longer with cancer, they live longer with heart disease, they live longer even with dementia. But they don't live longer whole and self-sufficient. They live longer with the kinds of functional deficits for which they need care, and that care is primarily coming from family members. The breakdown is 60% women, 40% men. When I used to show this slide 20 years ago, it was 70-30, so us guys are stepping up. And because I'm a baby boomer, I had assumed that this was just primarily a baby boomer occupation, but in fact, about 1/4 of family caregivers are millennials, so the age of our children, and another 1/4 are Generation Xers. So this is affecting kind of every age group within America, every ethnic group within America. But if you take all the 40 million caregivers and you boil them down to one caregiver, it would be a 49-year-old woman who's been caring for her mother for about 4 years. She also works at least part-time. She also works at least part-time, and she is what is called the classic sandwich generation caregiver. So she's caring for a parent in the generation above, and she also has some child care responsibilities, whether it be for teenagers or late maybe grandchildren, but she has other family responsibilities, and she is being pulled in 2 directions, and that's the classic sandwich generation caregiver. What we ask caregivers to do, and I will say this even as a healthcare professional, having been a healthcare professional for 20 plus years before I started caring for my mom, a lot of this was kind of shocking to me, that suddenly I had to step up and do these things, because there's a range of roles that most caregivers are not prepared for. So yes, we're going to be the companion to our loved one. We're going to drive them to their doctors and physical therapy appointments, and we may entertain them. But we're going to also be what I call a technical interpreter. We're going to be in the doctor's appointment. We're going to be explaining to the doctor basically who our loved one is and what's really going on at home, and then taking the information from the doctor and then disseminating that to the rest of the family in a way that the rest of the family understands. So the caregiver becomes a point person and a case manager besides. I recall when I would go to my mother's internist with her, my mother had like 4 or 5 specialists, and the internist, even though he was supposedly linked to the specialist via electronic medical record, none of the medication changes, none of the notes would be in the chart. And so as a caregiver, I would be saying, oh, this is what the cardiologist said, this is what the neurologist said, this is what, here are the med changes that were made. And fortunately, because I've been in healthcare a long time, I have some sophistication with this. I could do that, but many caregivers are, this is a tall task to ask them to play that case manager role. So given all this, and given the range of the number of caregivers, there's a range of reactions. So that about a third of caregivers will tell you that they're highly stressed, that these are folks that are going to be most at risk for some of the negative consequences of caregiving. but about a half of them are going to tell you that they're somewhat stressed. And I think Julie and I would have placed ourselves in this category, that this is hard work, but we kind of muddle along. We do the best we can. But there's another, small percentage of 16 to 18% of caregivers that will tell you that they're not at all stressed, and that many of these folks don't even identify themselves as caregivers. They identify themselves as dutiful daughters, dutiful wives, doing what's expected of them as good family members. And the problem with, that's wonderful in and of itself, but the problem with not identifying yourself as a caregiver is then you don't avail yourself of caregiver support services that exist in this county and every other county in the country. And so these are the folks that I'm often trying to figure out how do we get them engaged? How do we get them to accept the term family caregiver, which, as Elizabeth mentioned, is not a term that sounds great, and many times people don't feel comfortable with it. How do we help them see that accepting help empowers them to do a better job and doesn't in some way take away from being a good family member? When we look at the family caregivers that are most stressed, we look at three categories. So the first are spousal caregivers. And all the research comparing spousal caregivers to adult children suggests that spousal caregivers have much higher rates of depression, just have a much harder time in general. And it makes sense. Number one, it's a very different type of family relationship. You wrap your whole life in your spouse in many ways. Your whole sense of your past and your future are wrapped up in that other person. And if they've developed dementia, for instance, and are not able to be the kind of partner to you that they've been, that's a tremendous loss. And that begins to get at some of the anticipatory grief that you talked about before. We have hooked our lives to someone else. That person is now not who they were. We have a loss of companionship. We have a loss of a sense of a future with them. And those are big, big losses to live with. Another group are the military caregivers. Not surprisingly, given the high rate of traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder among military veterans coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Imagine the spousal caregivers in that situation who are caring for mostly men with those severe changes in personality, changes in emotional reactivity, changes in overall functioning. Very, very tough. And then the third group, and the group that, as I mentioned, the research focuses on the most is dementia caregivers. And dementia caregivers have very high rates of depression. About 50% of them have at least mild depression and are really hard-pressed, particularly in the middle and later stages of dementia. The middle stages being often when people with Alzheimer's disease have agitation, may have reversal of the circadian rhythm, and if you're living with someone like that, it disrupts your life and your sleep very, very severely. And then at the late stages of Alzheimer's disease, when someone needs complete care with their activities of daily living, you've got to brush their teeth, you've got to comb their hair, you've got to feed them, you've got to dress them, you've got to pick them up on and off the commode. It really takes its toll. So along those lines, there are two sets of research, and these are two very different sets of research that don't reconcile very well. So the first set was done in the late 90s and the early 2000s. The gentleman up in the right-hand corner is a social psychologist from the University of Pittsburgh by the name of Rich Schultz. And he, among other researchers, found a whole slew of effects of dementia caregiving on caregivers. And this is where we begin to get at this question of caregiver burnout. I would, just to kind of digress a little bit here, caregiver burnout in general is people who kind of wake up every day with a sense of dread, with feeling worn out, feeling irritable, feeling like, oh my God, I got to do this again, and feeling like they have no more zest for this activity anymore. And I think that oftentimes is the beginning stages of what Rich Schultz begins to describe. He found dementia caregivers showing up in doctors' offices complaining of insomnia, and they were getting up multiple times a night to make sure that their loved ones weren't wandering around in the neighborhood. That chronic sleep deprivation that they suffered then predisposed them to other health effects, so that, as I mentioned, they had high rates of depression and anxiety, and then they would have a lot of musculoskeletal pain, neck and back pain, literally from helping their loved ones on and off the commode, up and down the stairs, in and out of the car, and that this over time would really just kind of wear them down. And that because these caregivers were so devoted to their loved ones, they had a tendency to neglect their own healthcare needs. So that if they had their own diabetes or their own hypertension, and they didn't take care of those chronic illnesses, they then suffered accordingly. And in the most famous research article in the caregiving literature, a 1999 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Rich Schultz found that dementia caregivers had a 63% higher mortality rate in comparison to same age peers with the same chronic illnesses who were not caregivers. So when that research finding came out, it raised this big hue and cry in the public health community that caregivers are really an at-risk population and we need to do something to help them. So here is a typical example of what I think is burnout and just the sadness around Alzheimer's caregiving.
I don't think anyone can understand the intense, crushing isolation and loneliness of caregiving unless they have walked a mile in our shoes. I miss the intimacy we've had for more than 50 years, and I'm not talking about physical intimacy, although I miss that too. I miss having someone to talk to, or share a chuckle, or one of our little inside jokes. It's all gone. I'm not ready to ditch my marriage vows and dash out and have an affair, but I long to have a companion again, even someone to just stand and hold me while I cry the tears I've had to squelch and swallow for so long.
Thank you, Julie. I mean, this is an extremely sad piece of writing. Someone had written this as a comment to one of my articles on the AARP website, and I thought, my God, this was so powerful and so moving, and yet very, very common for folks in this situation. So these are some of the negative effects of caregiving, and just the sense of grief and sadness that seems to pervade caregiving, especially for someone who has dementia. But there is a whole set of research, more recent research, that's about the positive effects of caregiving. So the gentleman on this slide is David Roth. He's an epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins, and he's done very big epidemiological studies, not just looking at dementia caregivers, but looking at caregivers in general, and has found that rather than, as Rich Schultz found, caregivers were dying earlier, David Roth found that caregivers were living longer. So in his study, 16.5% longer. And so I don't know how to put those two sets of research together. And they were working from different sets of, different samples. And it may be that they were doing their research in different points in time, that maybe in the last 15, 20 years, there's been more caregiver support and caregivers are coping better. But I wanted to share this with you, that it's not all burden, it's not all bad. The caregiving can bring good things. So along those lines, there's a memoir that we like a lot called Bettyville. Has anybody here read Bettyville by any chance? So Bettyville was a memoir written by a guy named George Hodgman. He is a guy who grew up in a small town in rural Missouri. He grew up as a gay man. He moved out of the town and moved to New York City, where he became a well-known magazine and book editor. And then when his father died, and his father had been caring for his mother with dementia, he decided to move from New York back to the small town in Missouri. And so at the beginning of his caregiving journey, this is what he wrote. He said, all I could think of that night was what would become of my mother, that the time was coming. It was my turn to step up. I told myself that whatever happened, I would do this one thing right, better than I had ever tried to do anything, because even though my life was different, I wanted a place in the tribe. I still do. So when I read this, what I'm hearing is a man who sees his embrace of the caregiving role as a way for him to kind of prove himself in his own family, and that he wanted to have a place in the tribe, having always felt rather marginalized from his family. And so this was a way that he was going to be able to join the fold and be accepted. And then after he'd been doing this for about 2 years, and had been caring for his mom, living with her for all that time, this is what he wrote. He wrote, I know this home is just for now, but I treasure our days. I feel different than when I arrived. Nothing magical or radical, just a little more comfortable with myself. In my head, there was a kind of early morning quiet. because I have come through for her. It has taken me so long to feel okay in my own skin, but I feel better, more at home in the world most days. So what I get from this quote is, it went beyond just proving himself to his family, is that this being a caregiver enabled him to feel better about himself, that it helped him better accept who he was in his life, or whatever doubts or misgivings he had. And that so this became a very important way for him to prove himself to himself. Other folks who I think are nice exemplars of positive caregiving are, Lani Ali, who, as many of you know, took care of her husband Muhammad Ali for years and years, and she became, she's a woman of very strong faith, and became, in particular, a leader of Parkinson's caregivers. And she said many interesting things, but a couple of them is, she wrote, "When I wake up, I make the decision to speak in a joyous voice, to nurture positive energy, and to make this a good day," which I think is a way of approaching life that is something that we all aspire to, but she seemed to have achieved it. And then she wrote the disease. In her case, she meant Parkinson's disease, but I think we could apply this to any of the diseases that our loved ones have. The disease is not something to be afraid of. The more you know, the more empowered you become. Obviously, those of us who are professionals here, a lot of what we do is provide education, because when people understand the challenges, understand not the challenges of caregiving, but the understanding the nuances and the trajectories of the various illnesses, that gives us the means to do a better job. And then just to finish up this section, I want to quote from David Kuhn, another famous dementia caregiving researcher, who I think nicely encapsulates some of the positive aspects of caregiving. So he wrote, "The majority of caregivers readily endorse caregiving's gains or positive aspects of caregiving, including having the opportunity to serve as a role model, having the chance to give back to care recipients, experiencing an enhanced sense of purpose, feeling appreciated, and helping to maintain the identity and well-being of the family." So I think a very nice list. The one that kind of rings true for Julie and I is that when first, Julie was driving back and forth to New York to take care of her dad, and then later on when we moved my mother and stepfather up from Florida, we were very aware that our children, who were teenagers at the time, that their eyes were upon us, and that they were not happy, by the way, that we moved my mother and stepfather up from Florida to live a mile from us, because it disrupted their lives to a degree. But we were demonstrating to them that this is what family does. This is family members care for one another, particularly when times are tough. And we did this to teach them those values, and maybe one day they'll take care of us. You never know. You never know. So I think we can just end this section, and then we'll have a little conversation with some questions. And I don't pretend to have the answers to these questions. So why do different people have different experiences with caregiving? Does it have to do with different types of caregiving? So I mentioned that there are, being a dementia caregiver seems to be harder than being other types of caregivers. Or does it have to do with the relationship? I said that the spouses have a harder time than adult children. Or we could think about the relationship in terms of its history. Having had a good relationship with someone certainly is a better basis for caregiving than having had a bad relationship with someone historically. Or do people use different coping mechanisms? Do caregivers who meditate do better than caregivers who don't meditate? Probably. But it comes down to, I think, this general challenge. And the challenge is, if caregiving brings strains and gains, and I believe it does, how do we minimize the strains and maximize the gains in the caregiving that we do and in the caregiving that our clients do? So, with that as kind of a rapid overview of the research and just some ideas, let's kind of pause and have some conversation here. Anything that I said that was a surprise at all in regards to the research or the quotes? Okay, no surprises, and that's usually what we do. That's what psychologists do. We come in and we stand and we tell people what they already know, but we try to do it in a nice way and entertain them. So, yeah. Please, sir, your name is? You say Clayton?
Gary.
Gary. All right. I know. Where did I come up with Clayton? Excuse me. Gary, go right ahead.
The second quote about the caregiving benefits was a little bit surprising. I heard of the increased mortality. How do you reconcile those two studies?
I think that they probably were working with different samples. What I will say to you is Rich Schultz's research got a tremendous amount of attention at the time. There have been 5 studies that have tried to replicate his findings, which have failed to replicate his findings. So I think that his sample, his findings are probably an outlier, and that probably David Roth is a little closer to the truth. It's not that everyone's going to live longer. It's not like caregiving is a fountain of youth, but that people probably have a mix of experiences and reactions that so it's not all that caregivers are dying, which is what Rich.
Follow up on that, I have heard something, I don't know what the exact statistics are, of the phenomenal number of individuals who died before the loved one died. The caregiver died before the person with the disease.
Yeah, you certainly heard that with the story of Julie's mom. We've seen that many times. I can't quote you statistics on that. I think it's certainly a risk, especially if the caregiver is neglecting themselves. And so that seems to be the crucial variable. Yes, they're under stress, but if they're under stress and they're not caring for their diabetes, et cetera, then they're putting themselves in harm's way.
And that's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to help people identify as caregivers so that they can get the kinds of supports we're going to talk about.
Okay. Your first name is?
Carol.
Nice to meet you, Carol.
Yeah, thank you for tagging on military families. My father was in strategic air command for 28 years in the Air Force, and he and my mother isolated themselves from myself and my 2 other sisters in the last 10 years of their lives. I was living in California. My 2 sisters were there in Texas with them. The problem was that my dad always had a duty, and into the mix, I'm giving you kind of a difficult case here. My mother was bipolar and had several nervous breakdowns when I was growing up. Once she stayed in a hospital for a year. So I was a bona fide child. And so when I left the state, there was a fracture. We had no children, myself or my 2 sisters. So my dad was very independent, driving, going to the commissary until he was 93, and then he fell and broke his hip in the house. And my mother was in middle stage of dementia, we think Alzheimer's by then.
So they hadn't done any advanced planning for the possibility of this crisis.
They would not allow us to.
Yeah.
And my dad was a sound mind enough. You don't want to mess with my military days. Got him at junior. It's going to be my way. So anyway, that moment when he broke his hip. We had, my dad had to crawl to the phone and call the police because my mother would not allow anyone there. And even when the police came, she was paranoid, thinking they're going to take him away. So my sister had to come down from Austin, rescue him, take him to Fort Sam Houston. I know I'm kind of going on. I wanted to introduce another family system where the parents don't want your help.
Yeah, that's a really important one.
And
And
it's very dangerous. My dad
it is.
died.
so the tricky part there is at the point at which your story, really gets bad.
Yes.
You'd want to intervene way before that. I understand that both of your parents in different ways prevented that.
That's correct.
But what you want as let's say, children of aging parents, for example, is to be able to sit down with them and say, we know you're fantastic, you're doing great, you don't need us now, but can we make a contingency plan? What happens if something happens to you, Dad? What happens? Who's going to take care of Mom? How will we step into play? And certainly in my own family, we had no plan like that. So I understand. My dad was a bit more amenable than it sounds like yours might have been, but it creates a crisis, and everyone's living their lives, and all of a sudden you need to do something. You have to make huge changes in order to accommodate the situation.
Yeah. So this is, Carol, what you provided for us is an example of family dynamics. Every family's got its backstory.
Right.
And one of the main points that we're going to make today is we really can't, we're not in a position to best help people unless we understand the backstory, because then we will understand what caregiving means in the life of this family. Right. Your dad sounds like a very proud man who felt that it was his duty to take care of his wife.
Yes.
And so for him, the idea of accepting help would somehow detract from his sense of mission about caring for her, rather than feeling like accepting help would empower him to do a better job with your mom. So that's a kind of switch we work really hard on with folks, and it's a hard one. What I will say just in general is that the Veterans Administration has one of the top family caregiver support programs in the country. It's a great program, and it's sort of, if your dad was able to avail himself of those services, it could make a difference for him to be able to do what he wants to do, which is to care for his mom for as long as he can.
Well, what happened, I hate to say it, I'm going to be a naysayer on that. We tried to get help through the Veterans Administration, no go, and he had served for 28 years. So Miss Thing had to get on a plane. I had to go for 6 months to get everything organized. And my dad, who was in the military for 3 wars, I had to fight to get him his money.
Well, I'm sorry to hear
Really
that.
nice place in Austin.
Are your parents near Austin?
Yeah.
Yes. So what I would recommend, we were actually in Austin a week ago or 2 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago. And we've been there several times.
Yeah.
So there's an organization in Austin called Age of Central Texas.
Yes.
And I would be in touch with them, and I would in touch with Annette Juba there. We'll talk afterwards,
Yeah,
Carol.
we'll talk. My dad is passed now. That was
Okay.
2 years ago.
Yes.
I just wanted to, I wondered if there was any research with blended families. I think one of you, your story was, I think it was you taking care of your stepfather. And I just wondered, with all the, remarriage and just blended families with kids and stuff, is there any research about like more resentment because now I'm the daughter taking care of my mom's third husband, or whatever that is, and that's a really unique dynamic.
Yeah, yes, sir. Your first name is?
Arlene.
Arlene. Nice to meet you, Arlene. So I will say to you, on the AARP website, I've actually written 2 or 3 articles on this topic, because you are absolutely right. I mean, with the amount of divorce that's been in this country for 30 years, there are lots of blended families, and it greatly complicates the family dynamics. So sometimes it works really well. Sometimes the stepchildren and the second or third wife work together really well, and sometimes the stepchildren fight the wife who has the legal power to make decisions, but sometimes the stepchildren, the birth children, feel like they are the ones who ought to make the decision, and it becomes a kind of showdown. In my situation with my stepfather, my stepsister didn't want to have anything to do with her dad. I always had a very bad relationship with my stepfather. He and I barely said 2 words to one another over 30 years, and then lo and behold, I'm caring for him. And I did it because my mother needed the help. So you are absolutely correct, Arlene. It becomes much more complicated, and there's no one surefire way of handling it.
Well, and the other piece is, and I'm speaking for myself too, I am also a stepmom, where my children have their own mother to take care of. I mean, and so I don't expect them to take care of me, although they said they will. Told me they wanted to. But
That's really nice.
It was humbling. It was very humbling. But I mean, I just talked to a gal that's going to Sacramento to bring down her stepfather to take care of him, and there was just that dynamic of I should do this. No one else will do it. I can't quite turn my back. I mean, it's really complicated, and I'm seeing more of it.
There is a lot of that, and I suppose one way to think about it is that it's kind of impressive that people feel that level of responsibility to a family member who isn't quite their family member in some ways. It depends on the relationship, because that varies a lot. But it's pretty admirable that is a meaningful thing, and it makes people feel good about themselves to do it. So speaking of that, we're going to move on to keys to caregiving. So I'm just going to list them for you, and then we're going to expand on a few of them. Believe in the value of caring for yourself. As I mentioned, I wish my mother had done that, but it is extremely important, if you're going to caregive, to keep going, that you have to take care of yourself. Accept negative and positive feelings. This one we see a lot, and I'm going to expand on that shortly. Define commitments realistically. We talk to people about what you're willing and able to do for your loved one, and what you're just not. There are people who will say, you know, I'll go so far as to feed them, dress them, but I'm not going to toilet them. I'm not going to shower them. And then, you know, if we know that, then we can make a plan for what other possibilities there are along those lines. Utilize support. That's why people are here today, and that's something that we always talk to caregivers about. Selectively separate past and present. Hopefully we will have time to get to a case of mine that explains that. Find positive meaning in the sacrifices that you're making. That's really one of the most important things to keep people going when they're caregivers. So the caregiver psychotherapy, which is what we do, is we're trying to help people, as Elizabeth mentioned and is so important, to define themselves as caregivers if that's what they're doing. Because a lot of people resist that. They feel like they're just a loving family member. But if they define themselves as a caregiver, then they can look at their situation with a little bit of distance and they can think about what they need. Normalizing ambivalence in the face of loss and continued sacrifice. Anger was mentioned earlier. It's such a big deal for caregivers, and I'm going to talk about it. Encourage limit setting and flexibility. As I mentioned, that's so huge. Foster connection and cooperation. We want caregivers to talk to each other, to be in caregiver support groups, to go on the AARP website and see what's there. And you can post things too if you feel like just expressing yourself on there. Bolstering emotional regulation so that I know this happened with both Barry and I, you know, at the end of the day, after we'd had tension with either his mother or my dad, we would feel bad. So we're trying to help people not have to get so angry or so upset. It's one of the things we work on. And then lastly, perspective taking and positive meaning making. It's just something that we work on when we do therapy with caregivers. Promoting caregiver self-care. So we like to use the marathon metaphor as a way of sort of summarizing the tasks that the caregiver needs to do for him or herself. So learn the ups and downs of the course. If you're running a marathon, you want to kind of know where it goes and where the hills are and where the easy parts are. And if you're a caregiver starting out on your journey, it is so important to learn about the illness or the disease that your family member has in terms of how it will progress, what you can expect around the corner, what it will look like down the road. You know, when we talk to caregivers who get a diagnosis for their loved one of dementia, and we say, how long do you think you'll have to care for your loved one? Oftentimes people say 2 years. But dementia, the average length of time is 7 or 8 years, and sometimes it can be as long as 14 or 15 years. And so that person is going to burn out. They're not ready. They're not thinking about that marathon. They're running a sprint. It's like, I can do 2 years. But then, you know, at year 6, they're feeling depleted. So in the way that, you know, you prepare for a marathon, we want people to prepare for caregiving. Maintain a sustainable pace. So you don't want to throw everything into it in that initial period and then feel like I can't do this anymore. You want to pace yourself, just like in a marathon. Take any and all replenishment. If you get to mile 5 when you're running that marathon and people are waving water bottles at you from the sidelines, you grab one because you're going to need that water or you're going to get dehydrated somewhere, you know, like mile 9. And so what we say to caregivers is when people offer help, take it. It doesn't have to be exactly what you want, but anything is helpful. And if someone is offering to be helpful, you can also be very specific about what you need if you can come up with what that is, which is something that we work on. And then run alongside others. You know, just like in a marathon, there are people running with you, there are people cheering from the sidelines. We want caregivers to get support from friends, family, neighbors, and also know other caregivers and see their struggles and, you know, get support and give support to one another. So, assessment of self-care and coping. These are the kinds of things we will ask a caregiver if we're meeting with them. What do you need to get from start to finish? People don't think about it. They just sort of dive in and do everything they need to do as it comes up. in a little bit of a crisis mode, and we try to slow it down and sit people down and say, you know, what do you think you're going to need? And what do you do to relax when you're stressed out? A lot of times caregivers don't feel like they should relax, particularly if they're living with their care receiver. But even if they're not, we had Barry's mom and stepdad a mile from us, and it always felt wrong to relax, like we should be running over there, helping them in every free minute outside of our, you know, full-time jobs and child rearing. So it's really important to think about, to reflect on, what do you do for relax? What is relaxing? Is it watching a silly TV show? Is it sitting and having a glass of wine, putting your feet up? Is it meditating? Is it taking a walk, a hike? So just to come up with things that are relaxing so that you can mindfully do them as a way to, you know, calm yourself down from the caregiving. And how have you and your family managed other difficult times? As has already been mentioned a few times, there are so many complicated dynamics in families that when we ask that question, what we learn is a little bit of the backstory. You know, if sisters have been bickering for decades over who's mom's favorite, well, when it's time to take care of mom, yeah, there'll be some problems, and it's good to know what's been going on already so you can figure out what to do about it when it comes up again. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions about all this stuff that I'm racing through? Yeah.
Well, some of the challenges that I'm facing is my mom said things like, you don't have time for me if I take time out versus I pay. It's finding somebody else to take care of her, and I'm feeling like, okay, I'm not dumping her, but I'm neglecting my responsibilities.
That's an excellent point. So what you're saying is that according to your mother, you're the only person who should be taking care of her, and it should be pretty much full-time. So anything that you do for yourself, like coming here today, is taking away from her care. Now, honestly, that is not the truth. It's her truth, maybe, but it is not the truth. And you absolutely can ask somebody to help you out and get some time for yourself. That is how you maintain your ability to keep caring for her. It isn't reasonable for you to be the only person to do everything for her. And even though she may believe that very strongly, when we work with caregivers, we try to help them, you know, talk to their loved one and make arrangements. And even if it's uncomfortable at first, it's amazing how people adjust to a different person helping them out sometimes. And as a matter of fact, sometimes it's better because they're happy when you come back, and they've had someone else to talk to or listen to, and it expands their world a little bit. So it's complicated, but I don't think we want to start out feeling like I'm the only one who can do it right, because it's not true. We just have to do it well enough. It doesn't have to be right. Any other thoughts or comments or questions? Or yes?
Most of the caregivers I work with at Mission Harbor Behavioral Health are caring for their chronically mentally ill children. So they are aging parents that are wondering how they're going to provide for their child after they go. And you know, so this week I was talking to some people in their mid-60s who have this child that has severe OCD, and he's also mildly autistic, so he's not able to benefit as much from the treatments for OCD as he might otherwise. He's very rigid. And they were talking about their start to finish, you know, like what is this child going to need start to finish after they go? And I just wonder, like, what are the need differences? How should I work with them differently than the younger caregiver that's caring for the aging parent?
So Julie and I both had cases where a parent's caring for children with schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm, right.
And I mean, it's really heartbreaking. These parents are suffering in a lot of ways. What we have found, and maybe this resonates with your experience, is that these parents are committed to caring for their children. They see that as their responsibility and what they want to do. And at the same time, they feel tremendously burdened by their children's lack of independent functioning and the specific symptoms. Maybe their psychosis is very, very difficult to live with. And so just as you're saying, we often are in this position of trying to help these parents accept services, even residential services for their children, as what would not just be only best for them, but best for their children, not just in the long term, but also in the short term. And because what we see is these parents feel like if I put my child in a residence, I'm failing them. I'm bailing on them, and they have tremendous kind of self-criticism about that. Where what we would say is, we're trying to find a strategy to maintain a sustainable pace here, to get you from start to finish. So for as long as you can continue to provide for your child, and that a residential facility, for instance, would just be a tool to further that end. So does that meet?
Same concept, I guess, really, but yeah, for after they go, like we were talking about a guardian, a light up, like appointing a guardian and financial arrangement. This is so.
It's very, very hard, and so we see this a lot with the intellectual disabled community as well. So parents we see parents in their 70s and their children in their 50s, and they're still keeping them at home, and they're still very resistant to having their child go anywhere. And in part, I mean, it's that they would really seriously miss that child. So it's often a negotiation that goes on over a long period of time, having the child maybe go for respite care, give the parents respite care by trying out a facility, by getting involved in a day program with a particular agency, by developing trust between that agency and that family, those parents. I mean, it's a long courtship for many of these families. Ultimately,
That's very helpful. Yeah.
okay, yeah.
Anyone else have something they want to mention? This topic is extremely important for all caregivers too, normalizing ambivalence. You've probably seen in your work or even in your own caregiving, this need for perfection. Not only am I the only person who can do the caregiving right, but nobody else can do it nearly as well as me. So I'm going to do it all. And that is how people burn out. And I mean, I think with these parents of disabled adult children, it's the same thing. If I put him or her into some institution, they're not going to care for him like I do. And so what we try to help people do is think about what drives that perfectionism. It may be true that a facility won't help that adult child in quite the same way that his parents will, but is it not good enough? Does it have to be perfect? And certainly when we're caregiving our elders or our spouse, does it have to be perfect? Why does it need to be perfect? And what we have found is that a lot of that is driven by this this idea that feeling negatively toward your care receiver is unacceptable. So that as a way to compensate for what is sort of under the surface in terms of resentment and anger and frustration and all those kinds of feelings, people tend to be a little more perfect than they need to be. So we try to help caregivers recognize that everybody is human, everybody has feelings, everyone even can have the fantasy here and there of, I wish this person would die. And that feels so awful to caregivers oftentimes because they love their care receiver, they don't really want them to die, but it's so much effort and so much work and such a burden on the caregiver's life that they can have that feeling here and there, they can have that thought. And so we just try to make it a normal thing, to have anger, to have resentment, to wish the person dead. It doesn't mean you don't love them, it doesn't mean you're not going to do your best job caregiving for them. And when people start to sort of look at that and accept that, they can feel some relief, and we find that it allows them to be a little less perfect because they don't have that guilt about those feelings burdening them. And then maybe they're a little more open to accepting some help or just to taking it easy a little bit. So here's a quote. Many caregivers love the people for whom they're providing care, but don't always love all the hard tasks of caregiving. They feel frustrated and resentful at times. Those are normal feelings. We say to the caregiver, do you have feelings like that? And some caregivers will say, actually, my loved one, my mom, has always been kind of mean to me, and now I'm taking care of her, and I resent having to do this. And we'll go there. It's okay. You can resent it, and you can also feel like it's the thing that you need to do and it's meaningful. It's just being human. We're complicated. And yeah, go ahead.
Before you go there, there's another part of this that I've struggled with some clients, and that is that those that come out of a Christian perspective will deny having any negative feelings, and they feel that this is their job in terms of serving God and serving their partner and so forth. And any thoughts about how you work with the bubbling, underlying negative feelings that you sense that are not being talked about?
Well, that's exactly what I'm referring to. People who don't acknowledge that they have resentment and anger, and they feel like it's so wrong to feel those things. And you're right, if we bring certain religious beliefs into it, it gets more complicated. But even religious people that I have worked with, if I talk with them enough about how, being human means having these feelings, we aren't perfect. We have the whole range of feelings. And if I can get them to acknowledge it a little bit, it's relief. At the same time, we're saying you are doing God's work. You are caring for your loved one as you feel you should. It's good. It's just that even doing that, what makes this so challenging is some of those negative feelings.
I would just add, Gary, that, when you think about our experiences as parents, raising children isn't 24-hour sheer joy, there's lots of stuff that we may not enjoy all the time. We may not enjoy changing diapers. We may not enjoy disciplining children. We may not
Arguing over homework.
Having them stay up too late. We love our children. We are committed to being parents. But sometimes our children can get on our nerves. And that's normal. And people don't have the same, they don't beat themselves up for having those feelings at times. But when they're caring for their spouse or their parent, they do beat themselves up. So we're trying to to normalize this and humanize this as much as possible.
And we'll use that example. Did you ever resent your kids at all? Ever? Can you think of one example of being frustrated with your kids? And that's just a way of saying these feelings are normal. Even when you really love someone, maybe you love someone more than anybody else, you can still feel this at the same time. So limit setting and flexibility, as I mentioned before, we try to talk to people about what they can do, what they want to do, what they absolutely won't do, what they can't do, and we try to figure out solutions with them for those things that they can't or won't do. And it's so important because a lot of times caregivers start out saying, I'm going to do it all. I love my mom. I'm going to be a good daughter. She was a good mom. I'm doing everything. And then they get to the point of toileting or giving injections or meds or any people have all different limits. So we try to sort of slow things down and look at what they will do, what they can't do, and then we problem solve. So who else can we ask, or is this where we have to bring someone in and pay them to do something? How often do we need to do that? And what we're talking about too is what does the caregiver need in terms of limits? Can she be 24/7 on call every day, every week, every month? Or is there a need for respite? So we just talk all that through. And it's another issue where caregivers are often very resistant because they feel like they should be able to handle everything. My mother raised me, she didn't need help, although actually she did need help. If you think about it, the neighbors helped, sent me to a friend's house, there were babysitters, there was briefly we had a nanny, I don't know, and my dad helped. So if you're thinking about caregiving, you have to think about it in the same way. So what we say is everyone has limits about what they're willing and not willing to do, willing and able to do. What part of caregiving will be especially hard for you? And we try to have people reflect on that. Think into the future about what will be down the road that will be hard. And then we try to plan. So fostering perspective taking and positive meaning making is often the most important thing that we talk about because it's the thing that really keeps us going through that marathon so that we can get to the end. So some of the things that we'll do with people are we will identify and elevate purpose and value. So we call that honoring the mission, as Barry mentioned earlier. And he's going to talk about that a little bit. Intentional practices like mindfulness, daily reflection, writing in a diary, taking perspective. So we'll say to people, and I think Barry's going to talk a little more about this too, what will it be like when you look back on this, say, 5 years from now? How will you feel about what you did? And it's a way to get people to take some perspective and think about the importance of what they're doing and how it will hopefully make them feel good when they look back on it years from now. And then I'm going to talk about revising past victimization through present engagement and compassion. And we'll talk about someone who has seen me, who struggled with that.
Okay. So I'm not sure, did you all get articles that we wrote? Okay, so one of the articles is called Honoring the Mission, which kind of spells this out pretty clearly, but I'll just go over it really quickly. Because we have found this is a very good way of helping people kind of gain a longer view of their caregiving and the purposes behind their caregiving. And here, Honoring the Mission is basically just a series of very simple steps. So the first thing we do is we ask people about the story of giving care. I mean, in our conversations here today, we've begun to hear some of the family dynamics, some of the backstory that informs people's experience of their caregiving. And we need to hear what they're doing. We need to hear a little bit about the context of the historical context of what they're doing. And we know from our work that when one human being tells another human being their story and that second human being really takes it in, then that first human being feels that they've been heard, understood, and cared for, and a bond is formed. And then the second thing is, don't give advice, right? Because what all of us in the helping professions have a tendency to do is rush in with, saying to somebody, we have a support group once a month, or have you thought about getting a home health aide, or let me give you some literature. All of those ideas are great ideas, but at that point in the conversation, it's premature. And so instead, we want to ask them a little bit more about what caregiving means to them in their lives. And we want to ask them a question. And the question is a very simple question. So I'll hear the whole story, and then I'll say to somebody, why do you do what you do for your loved one? And there's usually a kind of pause, and people will kind of look at me like, what do you mean, why do I do what I do my loved one? And so the first answer you get is, well, because I love them. And so I don't usually settle for that answer. I say to them, well, what do you mean when you say that you love this person? And then people start to tell you a little bit of a story of their relationship with that person. And also they give you some indication of what are the values underlying what is a choice to give care. Because we always emphasize with caregivers that they are making a choice. They get up every day, they put their boots on, and they do this hard work at a choice. People will say, I don't feel like anybody was going to do this. That may be true. They're still choosing to do it themselves. So what are the values that are propelling them to make this choice? And once we hear what those values are, and we'll give you some examples of that in a second, we then say to them, I think what you're doing for your loved one is wonderful. I want to help you do more of it for as long as you choose to do it. So instead of telling somebody that in some way that they're not caregiving the right way, that we want them to caregive differently by using home health aides or different agencies, we're saying to them, you're doing a great thing. I want to help you do more of it. But caregiving is not a sprint. Caregiving is a marathon. And we know to help people get from start to finish, we have to help them to sustain themselves over the course of that race. And then I ask them the question, what will help sustain you over the course of the race? And it's a very small jump from sustainability to sustenance to be able to then ask them, what would be sustenance for you? And then oftentimes what happens is the caregivers themselves will come up with their own suggestions about what will be helpful to them. And then all I need to do is say to them, that's a great idea. So let me just to give you some examples of this. And when I asked Don, who was caring for his homebound wife, she had severe obesity and severe chronic pain, and she had been basically homebound for 5 years. I asked him, why do you do what you do for her? He said, Well, I love her, you know. I don't want to see nothing happen to her. He's from South Philly, okay? So imagine the South Philly voice. And I think I'm just that kind of person. We used to argue, and I would go to my sister's and stay overnight, but I'd feel so bad the next day. I couldn't picture her helpless by herself because nobody else is going to help. Nobody else understands her like I do. So I don't have the nerve not to help. I do it more for myself. So what are you hearing in this? A little bit about why he was caring for his wife. What are the values what are the motivations that he has that makes him get up every day and care for her? Guilt is a very powerful motivator. All right, but just to understand, it's avoidance of guilt. He wants to avoid feeling guilty if she were to suffer more. So what's one second, Gary? So what's behind that is, he actually cares about her. He doesn't want her to suffer. He doesn't want to feel guilty that she's suffering. She doesn't want her to suffer. And another component of this is that Don had been a really bad alcoholic. His wife had pulled him out of bars for years. And in his mind, she saved his life, because at this point in their lives, he's now sober. But he would never have been sober if not for her. So this is his way of giving back to her. She didn't give up on him when he was a down and out drunk, and he was not going to give up. He's not going to give up on her at a point when she's down and out. So that's a very powerful motivator. Gary, you're going to say something?
Well, I just sensed in the last sentence there for his own sense of self-respect.
Yes.
Really make it in a positive way. For him to feel okay about himself, he needs to do this.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's part of the way he sees himself as a good guy. If I'm going to be a good guy in this world, I got to do this. That's a pretty powerful motivator. Arlene.
Well, the other thing, based on the story you shared, is if he's at all active in recovery, he's making amends.
He's making amends.
I mean, that's part of his program, and that can also, I do it more for myself.
Correct.
So that's a piece of it.
Absolutely. So this is the backstory. If we say to this guy, hey, why don't you take some time off? We have some home health aides who can come stay with your wife. What is he going to say? He's going to say, heck no. This is the way I'm making amends. This is part of my mission. I'm not going to accept this. I'm going to do this myself. Until we can get to some of the values and begin talking with him about how using home health aides is a way of furthering his values, not undermining his values. So that's the crucial difference. Want to do the next one, Joe?
Lou was 12 years older than me. He was a hotshot elementary school principal. I always looked up to him and was always surprised that he was interested in me. My parents were too. My brother was Phi Beta Kappa at Harvard, and my sister was Honor Society at Yale. And then there was me. He respected me. When I decided to go back to school, he supported me 1,000%.
Similar themes, I think. This idea of having felt sort of kind of undervalued by her own family, and then meeting a man who gave her a sense of value in the way he supported her and enabled her to go on and become much more professionally than any of her family was expecting of her. And then when her husband is very ill with Parkinson's disease, then she says, well, of course I'm going to do this for him. He did this for me. So that, again, a very, very powerful motivator, which unless we know this, is going to get in the way of someone accepting help that we might offer them. The help that we offer has to be in furtherance of the values that she's describing here. But we don't get at those values unless we ask the question of why do you do what you do for your loved one? Make sense? Okay, I'll give you just one other short example. We're not going to have time to do, there's a longer transcript you have, but I'll just tell you more about this case, and it's very much along the same lines. This is Karen, 60-year-old woman, caring for her father in her home with Alzheimer's disease. She's been caring for him for 2 years. She goes to the doctor's office. The doctor looks at her and says, my God, you look awful. You look totally worn out. We've got to do something to help you. And what does she say? Sure, doc, whatever you say. She leaves. She doesn't follow up with anything the doctor wants her to follow up on. Because her sense of mission is her dad helped her leave her first marriage with a violent, abusive husband, he let her come home, and she always had a debt of gratitude toward him about that, because then she was able to divorce her first husband, go on and have a much better second marriage. Then she has this debt of gratitude. She's looking for opportunities to give back to him, and guess what? Alzheimer's disease is her opportunity to give back to him. So she's not accepting help from us in this room unless she sees that help as in furtherance of the sense of mission that she has. So we don't get, and again, we don't get at that understanding unless we ask. And then she tells a story of, my dad said I could always come home. He always had a place for me. I'm always going to have a place for him. Again, makes sense? Okay. That's what we call honoring the mission. As I mentioned, there's an article that you could read further about it. I'm going to skip these two, and we're going to go. I'll just say very briefly about this one, because we're running a little short of time, and I want to make sure we address these things here. What we're doing, I mean, I think you can hear kind of some themes. We want people to gain perspective on what they're doing. When, you know, it's a forest and trees issue. The thing about caregivers is you wake up every day, it's so much to do. You've got a list of things to do. You're spending your whole day crossing things off. You're racing from morning to night. And the whole day is consumed with activities and feeling like, you know, a sense of urgency, like what is the next thing? And then how do I get to here? And how do I drive to there? And how do I pick the drugs from the drugstore? You know, it's an awful way to live. So people can get very wrapped up in those trees and lose the longer perspective of the forest. And so when we ask people about their values, we're trying to have them get a longer view of why they're doing what they're doing and who they are. And here's just another technique for that. We call it perspective retrospection. And we basically say to people, I want you to imagine it's 5 years from now, and you're looking back on what you're doing now. What do you think you're going to make of this? So we say, how do you think you will look back at this time in your life 5 years from now? Very, very simple. And almost people will say, I think 5 years from now, if I'm not doing this anymore, but I'm looking back on this, I'm going to say, I'm glad I did this. I have had that, that's almost a universal answer. That if they don't have to put up with how hard this is every day, after the fact, looking back on it, most people can say, this was hard, but I'm glad I did it. And we want people to not forget that perspective. We want them to not forget that sense that there's a forest here, there's a sense of mission, that is what's driving them forward, what is the rationale for the choice to caregiver that they're making every day. Just another way of thinking about this.
And we certainly felt that after we were done with all our 9 years of caregiving. I want to talk about forgiveness, because usually when we talk about caregiving, there are people who say, but what about if you're feeling like you have to take care of your alcoholic dad or your neglectful mom or abusive husband? And it's a tricky issue. And like we said before, we talk about limit setting. So if it seems like it's really too much to do, and I have absolutely talked to people who have come to that conclusion, I will absolutely respect it, and we'll figure out what the other options are. But forgiveness to me is a complicated issue, and I don't actually believe in it very much. I feel like we can let go of some of the things that happened long ago, but we can't really forget them, so it's a little bit hard to forgive, and especially if the person isn't remorseful or doesn't remember it. So I sort of skip over forgiveness in a way, and I think of it as letting go, moving on, not forgetting, but letting go of the pain and seeing it as a memory not happening now. And the point is to reduce the intensity of the negative feelings, not because you're forgiving the person or that it's okay what they did, but because it was in the past and the person that you're caring for now is altered, they're diminished. It helps increase empathy and compassion if you can step back, because then maybe you can look at that person and think, wow, they were really troubled. They had their own problems. They were depressed and they treated with alcohol, or they were depressed and they hid in their room and neglected me. And so our goal in working with people with this kind of issue is to separate the past from the present. We're not denying that things happen. We're not denying that they are angering or disappointing or upsetting. We're just saying that those days are over. That's in the past. And if you're going to focus on caregiving a person who was a difficult person, then you want to leave those things behind, because if you don't, it makes it even harder to do the caregiving. So, and then lastly, I actually do believe you can forgive yourself if you have done what you can, and it's not perfect, because none of us are perfect. So I want to talk about Gloria. Do we have time for the transcript? So if someone would read it with me, that would be excellent. Anyone want to be Gloria? It should be in your packet. It's pretty quick, and she's pretty great. She's a nurse in her early 60s who is taking care of her mother, who has TIAs and type 2 diabetes and kidney disease, and who was a very difficult mother, very rejecting. Gloria would tell me stories about how when she was a child, she'd come home from school, and her mom would just lay on the couch. You know, the door would close behind her, and her mother wouldn't even say, "Hello, how was your day?" And her mother had a tough life. Gloria's dad left when Gloria was an infant, and the mother married Gloria's stepfather, but he died when she was a teenager, and she was very attached to him. So Gloria had it rough too. And she spent a lot of her life trying to win the love and approval of this very depressed, very difficult mom. So then it came time to take care of her. So anyone want to step up and read this with me?
Looks like Carol does.
Come on down. Thank you, Carol.
I think everyone should give a round of applause for Carol for
Yay.
volunteering. that was rather polite applause. I think we.
Stage time is stage time.
That's right. So you will be Gloria. Do you have that page?
I do.
Okay, great. I think you start. That's the other one. It's right behind that. Yep.
All right.
This was in a session, just Gloria and me.
You didn't even say hello again when I walked in. She didn't even say hello again when I walked in. I know she always done that, but I sort of thought now that I'm taking care of her, she'd want to at least say hello. But she just lays there on the couch. Obviously, she heard the door close, but she wouldn't even look over.
How did you handle that?
I decided I'll just overlook that. I went in thinking, this isn't about me. I decided she must be feeling unloved or, angry or in pain or something. I'm just an easy target.
So you didn't feel hurt?
Felt a little hurt. It's hard not to take it personally, but I went in as Nurse Gloria and started up the conversation as if I were walking to one of the rooms of the hospital. And I said, really, Chipper, how's the patient feeling today? And she responded, terrible. And then we just got into what was going on with her. I had to take her to her primary doctor that day, so it was helpful to hear all of her complaints.
You were able to treat her as if she were a patient, not your mother.
Well, it's really hard for me to not expect her to be a mom. I don't know why. I keep hoping for it. I've been disappointed every time. And then at this point, she's in pain with the TIAs. She's confused sometimes. She can't possibly do now what she wasn't so good at ever. I wish I could just stop, hoping for it.
Is there something more realistic that you can hope for?
I think when I am professional Gloria, she actually feels reassured that I'm taking care of her needs. She's usually nicer to me then when I feel hurt and get quiet. I want us to communicate better. I would really like her to appreciate who I am. I think she actually does sometimes, even though she never, comes out and says thank you or compliment me. There are times when, she'll talk to me like a friend, and I can tell that she needs me, and I'm like being effective, solving problems or easing pain, but those things are important to me.
You can feel good about what you've chosen to do.
I do feel good about it. It's hard how I know how I should do these things for my mom. It's what you do for your mother, no matter what or who she is. Thank you.
Oh, give Carol a hand. That was hard.
I have to say that reminds me of my mother.
I was thinking that maybe, yeah. I'm sorry. Terrific acting job. You get the part. So let's talk about what we heard in that interchange between Gloria and me. What was it that Gloria was saying she was trying to do?
Trying to treat her like a patient and not her mother?
Yes, she was trying to step back and see this mother, this difficult, depriving mother, as a aging, ill, diminished human being, that Gloria had the skills, because she was a really good nurse, she had the skills to help, which is very different from seeing her as the mom that Gloria was longing to please, longing to get love from, because that puts Gloria, that old state puts Gloria in this child to parent role that her mother hated, by the way, and didn't respond to very well. So when Gloria could be grown-up Gloria, professional Gloria, looking at her mom as a diminished, ill person, thinking of her mom as someone who had a lifetime of depression, feeling compassion for her, letting go of the old dynamic and the old longings, and being in the moment with her mom and just doing what needed to get done, that really helped them. That helped them relate to each other in a different way. Anyone else have a thought about that transcript, or Gloria? Yeah.
I guess I heard that Gloria really values caregiving, like it's one of her core values, and so she feels like she's living like in alignment with her values by caring for.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. Gloria, as a nurse, had a lifetime of wanting to be a caregiver, was a caregiver, valued it tremendously so that when her mom gradually needed care, it was going to be her. There was no doubt about it. So the fact that she could do it was extremely meaningful to her, yes. Even though her mother was so difficult and they did not have a good relationship. Any other comments on this? Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if that strategy could work for a lot of caregivers, that they kind of take on the role of being their professional caregiver so that they can step away from the emotional role of being their family member.
Absolutely, really good point. And when we talk to spousal caregivers, that's one of the things we really stress, that you have two relationships with your spouse now. He is your partner, your lover, the person that you're in love with, or that you at least are still with in some way, and he's the person that you're caring for. And you need to sort of, we gave a talk once and someone said, you really have to think of it as putting on two different hats. So when I'm caregiving him, I am thinking of myself as the professional caregiver. When I'm his spouse and we're sitting watching a movie together, I'm thinking of myself as his spouse. And that's certainly helpful in any kind of caregiving situation. Certainly, in Gloria's case, it definitely helped for her to see herself as a professional, an adult, a grown-up who didn't have those old childhood needs getting in the way. So definitely.
Let me just, if I could add one thing.
Yeah.
So I think when social service and healthcare professionals empower family caregivers to play kind of quasi-professional roles, by deputizing them to take on certain tasks. We want you to observe treatment effects. We want you to actually provide us with information that could be helpful in what we do. You're enabling them to take this kind of professional stance, more distant stance, so that they can wear this other hat of being, sometimes, in this case, in Gloria's case, she's being a nurse to her mom. most of the time we talk about people being a coach to the person they're caring for, because being a coach means you're involved, but it's not the same thing as being a daughter. It's one step removed, so you don't have to be as emotionally reactive to the situation. Caregivers can step into those coaching roles better if encouraged by social service professionals and healthcare professionals to do so, which is one of the reasons why it's so important that healthcare and social service teams embrace family caregivers as partners in care.
So I just want to, any other thoughts about Gloria? Yeah.
My sister, who was caregiving for my mother before I took over, called my mother by her first name, and she said she listened to her better. So she would say, Mary, do this, as opposed to Mom. She says, when I said, what, Mom, it didn't have the same effect as calling her by her first name.
Oh, how interesting. So I don't know if everyone could hear that, but her sister called her mother Mary by her first name rather than Mom. And it was a way to put that little bit of boundary there. And maybe it helped Mom not feel like she had to be humiliated or lessened in some way because she was being cared for by her daughter. So whatever works, if that worked, good for it. That's great.
Before we do the last slide, let me do this over here.
Okay.
Okay, so before we're gonna wrap up here, but let's see if we can take these things and try to incorporate them into what the conversation we've already been
Wait,
having.
I just want to say one last thing
Sure,
about
go ahead.
Gloria, which is she came back to me after her mother passed away and had a few sessions. And in the first one, she said to me, I took care of my mother for 2 years. And during those 2 years, because I could be adult Gloria, because I could have compassion for her and that distance and those boundaries, those were the 2 best years of relationship we have ever had. And she was crying, and it was so meaningful to her that she could create a better relationship with her mother while caring for her. So just wanted to finish with that. So it has a good ending. The markers are rolling around.
And yeah. Sorry about that. All right, so let's see if we can incorporate this. So I think you brought up, how do we prevent burnout? Okay, so we have in our room, we have all kinds of expertise with all kinds of access to services that are very helpful in preventing burnout. So we have home health agencies, we have support group leaders, we have church members, we have who are involved in kind of lay counseling. We have we have other infrastructure that exists in this county. You're going to hear more about it on the panel. But what we would say is people don't accept help unless it's consistent with their values that they have, and those values are rooted in the family dynamics. So we need to understand the backstory. We need to understand what does this mean? What is the sense of mission that a caregiver has, and how can using a home health agency further that sense of mission? If we are offering services without having first found out who that person is, we're not going to be very successful in having them accept help. So my answer to preventing burnout is let's understand who they are, what their motivations are, and then tailor the program of services we have for them to the values they have and to their own lifestyles. Does that make sense? Okay. Support groups, very important. I'm going to hear more about it in a second. Anger. We had, Julie talked about normalizing ambivalence. A lot of what people have a very hard time with is, those feelings of anger. But I will tell you, everybody gets angry. Everybody gets, and sometimes we don't like to call it anger. We'll say that someone gets irritable, right? Or someone gets frustrated. Frustration is a much more neutral word than anger. Anger has all these ramifications around it. But everybody gets frustrated. Everybody gets irritable. It's the nature of the territory. This is not easy work, and nobody. We have to assure people that nobody is going to be delighted 100% of the time with what they're doing, because you're doing a lot of difficult tasks, and often a lot of dirty tasks that if that really, given their druthers, people wouldn't want to do, but they have to get done, so people do them. So we want to make people feel better about that. And then, how have we done with anticipating grief? Probably we didn't talk about that enough, but certainly, especially with dementia, but even with diseases like Parkinson's disease, any disease where the person's personality is changing, where they may be having cognitive decline, where they're having diminished capacity to function in their traditional roles. There's an ongoing sense of loss through their downward turn, and that anticipatory grief. We want to give permission to grieve. Sometimes people feel they shouldn't grieve because they're giving up, but grieving prior to the person's death, unfortunately, doesn't mean we've given up on them. It means that we're just attending to our own experience.
And I just want to add for that, I try to help people find some time away from their loved one in order to deal with their grief, because a big problem is they don't want to look like they're grieving while they're doing their caregiving. They don't want to grieve with the person who's not dead yet. It's tough. So then they need an option to find a way to deal with some of that grief and the feelings of loss. And it's not only grief about their death. If you're taking care of a loved one with Alzheimer's or some kind of dementia, you're grieving their losses every day. They have a good day and you feel all happy, and then the next day they don't remember where they are. You feel terrible. So you're always grieving all sorts of losses, not just the big loss.
So any other thoughts, comments, questions about anything? Go ahead, Carol.
Can I just say one thing? I got to know my parents
The last 4 years in my life. And I really got to know my father. And that's why I became an advocate for veterans and worked with Soldiers Project for the last 10 years. In that he pulled out a harmonica, he started singing, he started playing it again. He started being playful because he finally had help with my mother. So I wanted to give that positive note. And then there was closure with my parents at the end. As my dad was dying, my mother finally went over and said, she said, Guy, thank you for everything you did. You were a good daddy. And just patted his hand and he died. So I got closure, the whole family got closure. I wanted to end it.
That's wonderful, Carol. It sounds like even though your dad was resistant to getting help, when he finally let you in, you had a really nice relationship.
And I got to really know him.
That's lovely.
Please.
Hi, I'm Sandra. So can you tell a little bit more about the millennium, like the millennials?
Millennials.
Because you said a quarter were caregivers. So I'm very curious about the research behind that and what we find.
So AARP just put out a report on millennial caregivers about 2 months ago. So I would actually go and Google AARP millennial caregivers. It's like a 10-page report. My recollection is that it just details that 1 of every 4 American caregivers is a millennial. That millennials are, we characterize generations, which how true is any generalization we're going to make, but that millennials seem to be taking on care tasks for their parents and grandparents very willingly, that they and that it is affecting their careers, their own accumulation of material goods, but that they're making the sacrifices to do this, and that they ought to be recognized for it.
And some of them were raised by their grandparents and are now caring for their grandparents.
Right.
That kind of situation.
Yeah. So I don't know, Senator, if that's answering kind of the question of what you're looking for, but I would look specifically at the AARP report, which is the first research report I know that's specific to millennial caregivers. Anything else you guys want to talk about? Please.
Is there a resource that would be like a guide to how to help a blended family have these difficult conversations?
So I don't know any caregiving book that's specific to blended families. What I will say to you, and I mentioned this before, if you go on the AARP website, and I feel like I'm kind of like promoting AARP here, and that's not my intention. I don't work for, I write for AARP, I don't work for AARP, but AARP is one of the major sources of good caregiving information. But if you go on the AARP website, you put in Barry Jacobs and put in step families, you will get, I think there is at least 2 articles I've written which will talk about some of the specific things that need to go on. A lot of the advice I give there is along the lines of what we say here, and that is we have to be very, very attentive to the family history, And we have to help people be able to step back from the past, some of the bad stuff that happened in the past, to see that sometimes the mission that we have now is we all love, we may not have seen eye to eye in the past, but we all love the same person. And so how do we work together for the good of this person? And maybe by the fact that we end up working better together than we ever have before, at the end of the day, after the person we're caring for dies, then maybe we'll have a better relationship than we ever had.
And another person who does work with blended families and step families, although not particularly around caregiving, but she might be a good resource too, is Patricia Paper Now. Paper Now.
Yes, thank you.
She writes great books about it.
Yes, she does. Julie, want to do the last slide?
So to sum up, caregivers come to us because they feel burden and strain. I have to tell you that actually, in my practice, people come to me and then they become caregivers while they're already meeting with me because everyone's going to end up being a caregiver sooner or later, pretty much. So they don't only come to us if they're burdened, but often they're burdened, and we have to look at that with them. We have to look at the negative stuff and find ways to support them that they're willing to accept given their values and their mission, and we're always looking to help people see the positives in it. And if it's really good, like with Gloria and perhaps with you, Carol, too, it can be transformative. And that's really what we want.
So if you've liked what we've talked about today, if anybody's interested, we've written, we don't have copies for everyone. You're welcome to come up and take a look at them. We have 2 books on family caregiving that we've written. You're
They're on Amazon.
But, otherwise, thank you very much for being, so attentive and being so involved.
Thanks.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, Julia. It's really terrific. Thank you for sharing your expertise. We are